private conversations, and you direct your attention up here, please.
Attention all.
You guys can look up
Attention all.
Thank you. Yeah. So, welcome to Regina Bateson's Town Hall. It's great to see everyone here. It's kind of a confirmation that democracy is alive and well in Walney County. We all know that town hall events have been a wonderful American tradition for hundreds of years, and it gives people a chance to vet their candidates, to ask them tough questions, and to make sure they are who they say they are. So tonight, the way this is going to work is there's cards at the table. You're welcome to write out questions for Regina. Raise your hand if you got a card, and a volunteer will collect your card. I'll bring it over to Emma here, who is the campaign manager, and she will kind of collect them and organize them so there's not 16 of the same question. And then I'll read the question out loud, and Regina will answer them. In fact, she will answer all of them. So. Just a couple little of my impressions. One of the things I really admire about Regina is her authenticity. She really is who she said she is. And her credibility was one of the reasons that the Sacramento Bee, the Modesto Bee, the Fresno Bee, and Merced Sunstar all endorsed her as the best candidate with a chance to beat McClintock in November. So, the thing that also kind of goes along with her authenticity, I would guess I'd say, is that in her capacity as a military strategy analyst at MIT, she is used to studying huge amounts of information and synthesizing it and boiling it down and coming to her own conclusions about an issue. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had a congressional representative who could do that sort of thing? So, as a result, her views and opinions are her own views and opinions. She doesn't have to rely on her staff to deliver talking points to her. She's come up with her own ideas and opinions. Because Regina has actually formulated her own authentic views and opinions, she's very consistent about maintaining them. So, for instance, throughout this campaign, her stance on healthcare has not changed. It's been the same for the whole time. Other candidates start out with one policy and then they drift to another policy and they don't really explain why they're doing that. With Regina, if there is some new information, of course she might change her opinion, but she will be able to justify her decision. Regina's solid and well-based, well-researched opinions also means she is independent. This means that if elected, she would not be so easily swayed by corporate interests or political party interests. Regina also has the courage to defend her views and opinions in public. It's kind of disconcerting to me that none of the other Democratic candidates would accept a challenge for a debate, and some people even backed out of a scheduled debate. And this is kind of, disconcerting. We don't get a chance to see their views and opinions. And, Regina's doing these town hall meetings where you all have a chance to ask her tough questions, but I don't think anybody else is doing that. And to me, it really does no one any good, including the candidate, if we let them skate by without intense scrutiny, right? This is the vetting process. Let's really grill them. Let's find out what they're all about. Gina welcomes the scrutiny, I think.
Yeah, let's do it.
Welcomes the scrutiny. Other candidates are trying to avoid any such scrutiny. So if you are looking for a candidate that is authentic, trustworthy, independent, and consistent, and has the courage to back up her views and opinions, then Regina Bateson deserves your vote on June 5th. Please welcome the next Congresswoman, District 4.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming today. That was quite an introduction. This isn't meant to be such a hard sales pitch. It's really meant to be a little bit more of a neutral forum where you can just meet me, get your questions answered, and get a sense for who is this person that's appearing on your ballot. that you're considering right now. If you're a mail-in voter, your ballot might be sitting on your counter at your home, just waiting to get filled out. So I really wanted to take the opportunity to come and meet you and hear from you and hear what your concerns are as well. I'll just start with a tiny introduction. Some of you I know already, some folks are new. My name is Regina Bateson, and I'm from Roseville. So that's all the way at the northern part of our district. Believe it or not, we're all the same congressional district here. I grew up there, went to the public schools, and then was able to go to college at Stanford. After 9/11, I graduated and I joined the Foreign Service. I worked in Washington, D.C. and in Latin America, and then got my PhD, and I was teaching at the university level. But I stepped away from that to run for Congress against Tom McClintock, because I think people here deserve better than him. I think we deserve a representative who actually cares about our district. We deserve someone who's going to fight for the practical needs of people here. So someone who's going to stand up for Social Security and Medicare rather than threaten cuts to those programs. Somebody who actually cares about expanding healthcare coverage, making healthcare higher quality, bringing down prices for people, rather than throwing people off of their healthcare and driving prices up for everyone, which is what we're getting right now. We deserve a representative who has strong policies on the environment. Our district includes Lake Tahoe, Yosemite National Park, and Tom McClintock is a climate change denier representing us. I'm really proud to be the only candidate in the race who's committed to join the Climate Solutions Caucus if elected. So I really give our district a seat at the table when climate policy is being discussed, which is so important for the local economy here. And then there's education. People sometimes think that there's this huge divide between Republicans and Democrats in our district. I'll tell you there's a lot of values that we share, and there are a lot of policy priorities that we share. And one that I find really unites people is education. I think everyone can agree that no matter a kid's financial circumstances or where they live, they should have access to a great public school education. That's how we create that fair, level playing field so that people who work hard can get ahead and can have that opportunity to learn and to grow and eventually to prosper when they become adults. So I think it's unconscionable that right now there are so many threats to public education coming from the federal level, and we need a representative who's going to speak out against that, against Betsy DeVos's destructive agenda for our schools. So that's why I'm running for Congress. I would love to take questions or comments from you. We're also taking questions online, I believe, and there is some light sorting and organizing going on here, but we will definitely take all your questions or comments. So even if you have a critical question or comment, that is totally fine. Feel free to write it down. I ask people not to use profanity if you can restrain yourself and try to avoid it, but let's keep it at least PG here. But that aside, go for it, have at it. I'd be really happy to answer your questions.
And just raise your hand when you have a question, we'll come by and pick up your card.
All right.
So first question, do you have any ideas how we could reduce fossil fuel nationwide? Ban fracking, no subsidies to oil companies, encourage electrification of transport, etc.
Yeah, this is a great question. We need to be doing everything possible to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We need to be investing in research into renewable energy. Tom McClintock is actually really proud of the fact that he's voted for over $1 billion, he's voted against over $1 billion of funding that could have helped to develop renewable energy sources and spur research and innovation in that area. His position is wildly out of step with people in our district. We know from surveys that about 80% of people in our district want to see the government investing in renewable energy. It just makes sense. You can look around at farms, stores, businesses. People are putting up their solar panels just about everywhere. It's a great way to save money and also for everyone to do their part in helping us to wean ourselves away from fossil fuels. I also think it's great that there's talk at the local level in some of our communities where there are larger freeways up in the northern part of the district of trying to put in electric vehicle charging stations along the freeway. If a local government makes that investment, it can be a way of luring people with electric vehicles off the freeway, bringing them over near some of our small businesses, giving a little boost to the economy. Maybe they have lunch somewhere while their car is charging, and then they continue on the way where they're going. So I really support those kinds of initiatives. But I think that when we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is sort of the ultimate goal of a lot of those policies, we really do need some big changes at the federal level. So I do support a carbon fee and dividend, which is a market-based approach. It has bipartisan support from Republicans and from Democrats, and would result in us pricing carbon emissions, pricing greenhouse gas emissions according to the damage and the problems that they're causing in society. And so giving manufacturers, and large-scale polluters incentives to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions as much as they could, which is what we really need to do to tackle climate change. And we need to do that as soon as possible.
Next question. Can you tell us your position on the tax bill, raising taxes?
Which tax bill? Okay.
Well, I'm not sure.
So let's see here. So I'm guessing that the tax bill in question, if somebody wrote this and I'm wrong, let me know. I'm guessing it's the GOP tax bill that was just passed in December. My position is that I was opposed to it. That tax bill, it blows up our national debt, which is supposed to be something that fiscal conservatives can't stand for, but McClintock voted for it. And at the same time, it raises taxes for a lot of Californians, really targeting states where there are high property taxes and high state income taxes, because it limits the deductions that you're able to take for those now. And we don't really get much in return. That bill is basically driven by a blind faith in trickle-down economics. And we tried that. It didn't work. So I can't see why we would go back to that again. And at the same time, now all of a sudden the deficits that are being created are being used as the excuse to threaten yet more cuts. I think it was the very same day that he voted for the tax bill that Tom McClintock started talking spending reform. Now we know what spending reform is code for. Cuts to really important programs that affect all of us. Especially Social Security and Medicare are on the chopping block. If Congress doesn't act to stop it, Medicare could face very significant cuts this year, basically because of that tax bill. So what we need to do, I think, is make sure that the very wealthiest and large corporations are paying their fair share, and that we're not exploiting our deficits while doing very little for middle-class families, which is what the bill does, I believe.
Okay, next question. Oh, by the way, if you've got a question, maybe while I'm about to read this, you could raise your hand and someone will come and pick it up for you. Thanks. So the next question is, what's a realistic estimate of when universal health care could become a reality?
Well, estimating timing of legislation, I think, is really hard. I do think it would be after 2020. I think that we're going to need both some time, but also someone different in the White House to actually get the kind of legislation signed that would get us closer to universal health care. I think there's a lot that the next Congress can do between 2018 and 2020, though, to put us in a good position to then move forward more aggressively, hopefully after there's a different president elected in 2020. I think that the short-term priorities have to be stabilizing our individual insurance markets so that premiums don't continue to rise for everyone. I think we could make a real difference when it comes to prescription drug prices in the short term, because there's a good amount of buy-in and support from Republicans also. There are some basic things we should be doing. Medicare should be negotiating for prescription drug prices. I think it's crazy that they're not doing that currently. And I was very interested to see what Donald Trump was going to say about this. On the campaign trail, even Donald Trump was saying that he wanted to see Medicare negotiating drug prices. And then he caved, basically. He came out with his actual proposal a few weeks ago, and lo and behold, that's missing. But that was actually something that a lot of Republican voters wanted to see happen as well. There's a good amount of agreement among the American people that we should be tackling prescription drug prices, and especially the rates that Medicare pays for them. And then we need to be expanding coverage. My view, after 2020, there are a lot of ways that we could do that. I think we need to start building out the idea of adding a public option into our existing insurance system. I think that makes a lot of sense. It would ensure that even people who are in counties where there aren't a lot of choices of health insurance would have at least one high-quality option that they could buy into. But I'm very open to other potential solutions. I do think that it's absolutely a crime that we have here the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and we are not providing basic care to our citizens. So we need to get there. The models that I think fit the best or the most realistic, given the structure of the insurance system in our country right now, are probably something like Germany or Switzerland. Something where you have a combination of public and private insurance, but you do get to universal coverage. I mean, those countries do get to excellent outcomes that I think would be, care that would be the envy of a lot of people here. I think there are other really great systems in the world. My husband's Canadian, for example, and so we've had, and he's certainly had some firsthand experience with health insurance there. And I can tell you, when his parents need some kind of treatment, it's easier. Their lives are simpler. They don't get inundated with bills flying in for months and months afterward, really complicated paperwork. But the fact of the matter is that we're not starting from scratch. We already have a system that's in place, and even if some of us might wish that our country made different choices back in the 1940s and back in the 1950s, I think we have to be realistic about the fact that I don't see a way to completely blow up or eviscerate the current system and start fresh. I think that, in my mind, it makes more sense to build and build and expand, and recognize that we have made some huge progress in just the last few years. Sometimes it's easy to forget what life used to be like before the Affordable Care Act. But the Affordable Care Act cut in half the number of people in our district with no insurance. Cut it in half in just a few years. That's a huge success for any new federal program. The Affordable Care Act has made it so that people who are up to age 26 can stay on their parents' insurance. I didn't have that option when I was graduating from college. I really wish I would have. That's really important. Also for all of us, even if you have private insurance, the Affordable Care Act put into place out-of-pocket maximums per year. It used to be the case before the Affordable Care Act that medical expenses were one of the leading causes of personal bankruptcy in our country. And the majority of people who went bankrupt from medical expenses actually had insurance, but you could still get hit with massive bills. I worried about this myself when I found out I have twins, in case anybody doesn't know that. And when I found out I was going to have twins, I was literally in this ultrasound room. The technician was trying to tell me that I was having twins. I didn't really get what she was saying at first. It took a little while to sink in. But then she started saying that they might be a really medically complicated kind of twins. And it was possible that I might be in the hospital for months, they might be born very early, and then there would be 2 of them going into NICUs. And I was just doing the math in my head about how expensive this was all going to be. Being an inpatient yourself, having 2 other patients from your family. You could easily be over $1 million of care, easily. And, we had this health insurance where, like a lot of people, if you go to the hospital, 80% is covered and then 20% is the part that you pay. And so in my mind I thought, man, we could end up with $200,000 or more of medical bills. And, we're perfectly responsible people just going about our lives. But who could afford that? That's like buying a house or something. And, I was so upset about it that I just really couldn't pay attention to the rest of the appointment. And by the time we got out to the parking lot, there was this little voice in the back of my head. It said, this isn't supposed to happen anymore. I thought the Affordable Care Act did something about this. And so I did some Googling right there on my iPhone, and I was able to find the out-of-pocket maximums. And just calmed down, and was able to say, okay, I don't have to worry about just being completely financially devastated by this news. We can actually think about the next steps that we need to take. What doctor do we need to get referred to? How are we going to manage this? How, do we need to buy a minivan? And the answer was, yeah, we had to buy a minivan. But, I think that having that basic protection, knowing that if you've got insurance and you're doing the right thing, you're not suddenly going to get hit with bills for hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's really important. I just feel strongly that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, scrap the improvements that we've made. We got to keep them, and then we got to keep building and moving forward, I think. But to answer the question, unfortunately, I think we could make some serious improvements in the next 2 years, but I think to get to universal coverage, it would probably have to be after 2020.
Okay, next question. Keep the questions coming. China is investing to lead the world in electric cars. The U.S. is not. What would you do to change this?
Oh, I really agree with the premise of the question. I mean, I think that we need to be keeping in place and actually continuing to push on fuel efficiency standards for auto manufacturers here. They can then meet those requirements by having a larger percentage of their fleet be electric vehicles. As I was kind of mentioning before, I think that we also need to be investing in the infrastructure that we need for it to be realistic for people to have an electric car. I mean, at one point, I've looked into that myself just as a consumer, and I do worry. Well, we drive around the area a lot, we go on long trips. Right now, we're kind of in a chicken and egg situation where I think that the lack of infrastructure impedes some people from making their next car an electric car. So we need to be investing in that, but also continuing to give automakers these strong standards and strong fuel efficiency standards they need to meet, and then that will hopefully push them to include a greater number of electric vehicles in the portfolio that they're selling here.
All right, next question. You are seeking to represent a district full of cultural resources and historic buildings. If you get to Congress, will you join the bipartisan Historic Preservation Caucus?
Sounds great. I would like to do a little bit more research before signing on the dotted line and firmly committing. But I think it sounds great. I think it sounds like a great idea. And I thank you for the suggestion, because I do think that we have amazing resources here in our region, and we need to be doing everything possible to protect them and also to really share the culture and the attractions that we have here. I think that that's actually, there's a lot of technical hard things that a representative can do, and of course capacity to go out and propose legislation. But then I think there's a lot of informal things that a representative should be doing for our area also. And one of those things is being a great ambassador for us. I mean, really being a representative and being out with civic organizations, being engaged with organizations nationally that are relevant to our district, and trying to help raise the profile of our area. We have such beautiful, amazing spaces. I think that the world needs to hear about them more. And I'm personally really offended when I look at the speeches Tom McClintock gives on the House floor right now. I haven't counted this up in a while. You guys have inspired me to maybe go count up how long it's been again. He often goes months without mentioning his own district. Months in his speeches on the House floor. There was one point last year where he went 6 months without mentioning us at all. And he gives speeches about other things. So he gives speeches about, ideology and sort of high-level policy and things, but, really doesn't do much to kind of raise awareness about the needs of our district, or really even, speak to the people here. And I think that's wrong. I think that you need a representative who's going to be a champion of our district in ways that are formal, through legislation and working with local elected officials, but also informal, trying to spread the word about what a fantastic area this is, and raising our visibility and our profile.
Okay, this is two separate questions that are quite closely related. So you plan to join the Climate Caucus. How will you go about getting a partner GOP representative to join you? And the second part that goes with this is we'll be totally out of the Paris Climate Accord in 2 years. Is it possible to get back in?
Okay, so the answer to the last question, I hope so. I think that leaving was completely the wrong move, and so I would absolutely hope that we could get back in. In terms of the Climate Solutions Caucus, you're absolutely right that to join, they like to keep it balanced. They like to keep the same number of Republicans and the same number of Democrats in there. So you do have to find a Republican to join with you at the same time. There are some possibilities out there. I do know of at least one pretty moderate woman who's a Republican who's running in Florida right now, in Carlos Curvelo's district. And if she ended up being elected, she's someone who also wants to join the Climate Solutions Caucus and thinks it's really important. There are candidates like that out there on the other side of the aisle also. So it would be a little bit challenging, but in talking to people about that caucus, I haven't actually heard this really mentioned as an absolute impediment for anyone. I think that if you put your mind to it, you've got 435 people to choose from, or 434 not counting yourself. There are reasonable Republicans out there who believe in facts and science and care about conservation. And I mean, even here in California, we've seen some interesting folks, proposing kind of new ways of being a Republican. So down in Southern California, I'm forgetting his first name, his last name is Chavez, I'm pretty sure, who's running in ISIS district. Who knows what will happen there? I'm sure a lot of people are rooting for a Democrat to win that seat, just given the crowd of people we have here. But he's an example of somebody who's actually, at least stating, that he's a pro-environment Republican, and has actually been pushing at the GOP here in California to be sort of more reasonable when it comes to science. And he's explicitly come out and said that if the GOP becomes known as a party that ignores science, it has no future here in California. So there are people there within the party who are a little bit different, or a little bit kind of out of the prevailing mainstream, and maybe some of those folks will end up winning their elections. I should say that my understanding of that situation is that when he came out and said those things, the rest of the GOP kind of came and cracked down on him in California. So we'll see what his views really are at the end of his campaign, and who ends up holding that seat. But that's to say that I'm optimistic that hopefully from both parties there will be some reasonable, science-oriented people getting themselves elected in 2018.
Which caucuses do you plan on joining if elected?
So the two main ones, we've talked about the Climate Solutions Caucus a lot. The other main one that I would join would be the Problem Solvers Caucus. And that's a group that's half Republicans, it's half Democrats, and they just set a few shared priorities at a time. Really important issues that they want to work on just to keep the country running and functioning. Because when we look at Washington right now, it's a disaster. I don't see, that's all I can say. There's not much governing happening. All too often, Congress is not even passing budgets. They're not passing the appropriations bills on time that need to accompany those budgets. You have absolute gridlock, repeated threats to shut the federal government down. And that's not the way any of us would run a business. It's not the way any of us probably manage things within our own families or any other organization. So I think that we've got to build more bridges and at least have a framework for conversation across the two parties in Washington. And that's really what the Problem Solvers Caucus does. And they have come out and proposed bipartisan legislation to try to move forward on some really intractable issues this year. They came up with one of the first bipartisan bills that tried to protect the Dreamers and find a solution when there was this budget impasse. I think it was back in February, and the Dreamers were essentially being held hostage, and the two parties were just not talking to each other. It was the Problem Solvers Caucus that came up with the first sort of bipartisan path forward and did that work of reaching out to some of those Republicans and saying, hey, can we find a solution with you guys? So I think we need to grow the size of groups like that. I think it would help the functioning of the country, frankly.
The Democrats failed this country in not establishing an immigration plan and temporary worker plan during Obama presidency. I think because they were afraid of losing the Hispanic vote. Do you have a plan suggestion? I think that most Hispanics would like to have something to stabilize their own status and families and DACA young people.
Okay, so there's a lot there. It's true that people from both parties have been talking about the need for immigration reform for a long time, and it hasn't happened. I'm not sure if the blame really lies entirely with the Obama administration. A lot of the blame certainly lies with the House, where it's been really hard to get any kind of agreement or any kind of movement on immigration for years and years. And that's a big part of why we need to go change who is in the House of Representatives. I think this is really important. If elected, I would be actually the only person in Congress who's ever issued or denied a visa and has ever really had that firsthand experience in our immigration system. And I think that we need more people who really understand the system and understand how urgent this is. It's really hard when you're the person who is sent out there to enforce our laws, and you see how sometimes they don't make sense when they're applied in the real world. Or, sometimes the outcome can seem really unfair to some families. We would occasionally see people who had an adult child They were trying to all immigrate to the U.S. together. If that child goes and gets married, depending on the details of how you're immigrating, they may not qualify to come with their family anymore. There's all these little catches and tweaks, and I also saw how the system doesn't necessarily meet the needs of employers right now, especially when we look at the H-2B program, which brings temporary, seasonal, unskilled workers to the U.S. to do non-agricultural jobs. There is a ton of demand from employers, and they are perfectly willing to do the paperwork, to show that they can't hire Americans for these jobs, to pay thousands of dollars, to get certified to actually apply to bring workers to the country. But then because of caps that Congress has put into place, a lot of them can't get the workers that they need. And their requests just go unfulfilled. This is really frustrating to them. So I think there are several things that we need to do. I absolutely support pathway to citizenship for people who are here right now, who are undocumented, who can pass background checks and pay fees. But we also need to use smart technologies along the southern border to make our border as secure as it can possibly be. I think we need to put in place an exit system to actually track when people leave the country, because right now a lot of undocumented immigration results from people getting visas, coming into the country, and then just staying. And it's actually really hard if you're a consular officer. It's hard to tell when someone has left the U.S. in the past. So if someone had a visa, they were supposed to come here for a year to be a student. It's now a couple years later and they want to get another visa. The consular officer who's interviewing them typically can't tell how long they stayed in the U.S. Because if you think about it, if you've left through an airport in the U.S. recently, in most instances you just walk on out, essentially. We don't do a good job of tracking when people are leaving our country, and this is actually really important for our security as well, because we need to be able to track people's travel patterns. And when someone is renewing a visa, as the person approving that, you want to be real certain that they were doing things in the U.S. before that were consistent with the reason why they got the visa in the first place. If someone was supposed to go on vacation to Disneyland for 2 weeks, but they actually stayed for 3 years and somehow ended up leaving from New York City years later, something went wrong there. That's not somebody who should necessarily be getting a visa again. And the 9/11 Commission actually recommended that we keep track of people's exits from the country, and it's just never been done because Congress hasn't funded it. So I think that we need to take some of those smart measures that can really improve our security, while also putting in place pathway to citizenship for people who are here. And I think that completely separate from everything I just described, we also need a Clean Dream Act, period. I think this should be, day one of legislation. If control changes in the House, we should go try to pass a Clean Dream Act. Because the main impediment to that right now is just the fact that, the Republicans and a few particular folks within the GOP are controlling the House, and they don't want to let a Clean Dream Act come up for a vote. There's good reason to believe that the votes might be there. Certainly, I think after the November 2018 elections, the votes would be there to pass it. We know that a majority of Americans really support this. And we got to think about what democracy means. If a majority of people in our country want to see something happen, we shouldn't allow a few people in Congress to keep winning re-election when they're blocking the will of what the American people want to see. So I think we need to have a separate Dream Act that needs to be our top priority, and then go for bipartisan immigration reform.
Can you please speak on your thoughts about resolutions and hearings? Do you find them necessary?
Yes. So I think we may have talked about this a little bit before the event started. Is it okay if I relay this a little bit? So apparently Tom McClintock has, at least occasionally, or his staff, have told constituents, or at least a constituent here, that they're not interested in pursuing resolutions or hearings because I guess they don't see them as worthwhile or a good use of time. I think that doesn't make any sense at all, and that's actually the kind of dismissive, sort of belittling behavior toward constituents that I think is really wrong, and that we really shouldn't stand for or tolerate here. So I think that resolutions and hearings serve a very important purpose, which is to bring experts to Congress to testify, to educate the public and educate members of Congress about different issues. They lay the groundwork for legislation so that there's then a body of evidence that people are familiar with and the staff are familiar familiar with. So if you want to move into actually pursuing a bill, there's already a conversation that's been started. And again, I think dialogue is really important in government, and this is yet another example of Tom McClintock trying to shut down conversation. And I think both in terms of how Washington works, I think they have an important role, but then also, I'll just say that I think anyone who would respond to a constituent's question by just saying, I just don't do that, it's just not something I'm interested in, when this is clearly part of the job of being a legislator, I think it's completely wrong. And I think constituent services is one of the things we really need to improve here in this district. That's why I would open 2 offices if elected. Right now there's only 1 office, for McClintock in Roseville, which is really far from you. I mean, I can tell you that we just did that drive. I don't think you should be forced to do that drive just to see your representative. Right now McClintock has these little office hours here and there with his staff, but you don't find him at those office hours very often. And then you're forcing people to just have 1 opportunity per month to interact with the staffer from their representative, and you have to do that then on the staffer's schedule. I think that your representative should be much more accessible to you, and should remember that you're the people that I'd be working for. So that's why, at this point, my proposed location for the second office is Sonora, because it's, a large town in this area. I think it would make a lot of sense. And obviously you can only be in one place at a time, but I think that having a staff member who did constituent services in this part of the district would really make a difference, especially for older people who often have problems with federal benefits. So much of the job of a representative is actually nonpartisan. It's just about helping people make sure that they're able to get the services that they need from government.
Would you like some water?
Sure. All right. Thank you.
Keep your questions coming if you've got.
Oh, you guys have a lot. This is good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Next question. Citizens United has been a disaster. Political parties are endorsing candidates based not on their merits, but on how much money they can raise. What ideas and proposals do you have for reducing the influence of money in electoral politics?
Oh, this is a great question.
So
That's a great question. So I should say that this is something where our campaign is rather unique. I actually got started running with a little crowdfunding website. And, I didn't get started running because there were sort of fancy people from any party or, PACs or anyone trying to recruit me to do this. It was really because one of my former high school teachers encouraged me to. And, I had this website last spring, this was more than a year ago now, that we launched just to allow people in the district to make sort of small contributions online. And it went a little bit crazy. Some of you may have been part of that, but it spread very rapidly through the district. And in little bits and pieces, within a few weeks, people had contributed about $20,000. And that was how we got started. And that's always really been the emphasis of my campaign. But the truth is that for most people, it's very hard to start a campaign in that fashion. And it's very hard to stay true to sort of that model of grassroots engagement and grassroots fundraising as you grow larger and larger. The vast majority of congressional campaigns in the country, you do see a lot of influence of special interest money, big contributions from PACs, and large maximum value donations from donors, many of whom are often outside of the district in question. This is also something that distinguishes me in this race, that I've raised the largest proportion of our money here inside the district. And I think that matters, because I like spending time here with you all, not in the Bay Area or in Southern California or something like that. So that's a little bit about how we've managed to do things differently, but my experience as a candidate has really showed me that that's not the norm. There are a lot of problems in the system we have right now. I'm completely opposed to Citizens United. I think it's a disaster for our democracy. That said, it's not within the immediate control of a representative to literally just go end Citizens United in one fell swoop. That's in the hands of the courts at this point, basically. So what can we do within that system to make things, a little bit more transparent at least? I think that we really need to start by focusing on digital advertising. We've seen so much spending, so much manipulation of our elections coming through the internet these days. And there, right now, are no disclosure requirements whatsoever about political advertising online. You know, if you look at your little brochures, anything we print has to say who's paid for it on there. But if we go and put an ad online, there's no requirement to put that right now. In a lot of cases, people are seeing things online that are advertising and not even realizing that it's advertising or that it's been paid to be promoted to you. So I think we need a lot more transparency, and I would absolutely start with online transparency because I think it's an area where the law has not caught up to the reality of how campaigns are won and how information is communicated in our country right now. I think that would be a good start.
What would you do about the waste in the military-industrial complex?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think it's really critical that we have strong accountability across, all branches and departments in our government. Right now, some of the inspector general positions in our government are not even staffed. I mean, the Trump administration has really gone through and gutted some of the offices that are dedicated to accountability. And I think that's not a coincidence. I'm really concerned by the glimmers of corruption that we're seeing. And I think that we really need to make sure that there's strong oversight from Congress to be investigating. Right now, I mean, even just what we the public are seeing is very concerning. We know that military contractors tend to be another area where there can be a lot of wasteful spending. And so I think that Congress needs to have strong oversight in that area also. In many cases, it makes more sense to bring in, a long-term, actual federal employee to do the job rather than be cycling through contractors who, sometimes end up charging the government more money than it would cost to really train someone and keep someone in that position for years and years. So I think we do need to be very careful about the use of contractors in particular. But I think the biggest thing that we need to do to crack down on waste, fraud, and corruption is make sure that we have strong accountability and oversight from Congress, and make sure that we actually have inspectors general in position who can investigate fraud and waste within all of our departments.
Similar question. What would you do about the prison industrial complex?
Yeah. So, there's not an easy answer to that one at the federal level, I don't think. And a lot of this policy is in the hands of states. And we see wild variation across states in terms of carceral policy. I think it's very important to be investing in education. I absolutely think that something has gone wrong in our society if we're spending, even in the ballpark of as much money on prisons as we are on education. We also really, I think, need to do a much better job of, investing in mental health care and in substance abuse treatment, in programs to address homelessness. I mean, I actually was just having breakfast with one of our sheriffs this morning, and, we were talking about the fact that a huge percentage of their workload, what our local law enforcement is dealing with, is really just calls that involve those three things in some combination with each other. Substance abuse, mental health, homelessness, and, a lot of times, maybe someone is breaking a fairly minor law, they get hauled off to jail, they spend the night there, they come out the next morning and are back in the same situation. Nothing has been done to really deal with the circumstances of their life or the challenges that they're facing, and then they get arrested again the next week and sort of cycle through it. I mean, I realize this is not exactly what the question's about, but it was just on my mind because we were talking about this today. I think that we do need strict regulation of our prisons. I think that we should be moving away from using private prisons. There's not, again, that introduces really perverse incentives when you have companies out there that need people to keep getting arrested and keep getting incarcerated to make their money. I think a lot of Americans don't realize how prevalent that is. But I also think that the bigger sort of structural things we need to do are we need to rethink our priorities. And that if we could really invest in people and invest in their health and well-being and do that so that there are the resources they need there consistently over their lives, not only could we keep people out of our jails, but they'd be living, healthier, happier, more productive lives themselves also. So I think and it saves us money in the long run in most cases. I mean, the very high users of both emergency rooms and, kind of pass-through visits to our jails costs us tons of money per year. We could better direct that money toward actually helping them, have a better living situation.
So kind of a follow-up question, really. It says, what would you do about social justice?
Yeah, so this is a very broad question. What would I do about social justice? So I think it's very important to say that there are a lot of things where I consider myself a pretty moderate, pragmatic person. I'm usually about just how can we do the most good for the most people. I was just talking about rooting out fraud and corruption and waste, and trying to figure out how can we save the most money. How can we just get the best results? But I think there are some really important values that to me are non-negotiable. The biggest one is, equality, non-discrimination. And I think we're in a really dangerous time in our country right now. We have a president calling people animals. And as someone, in my academic career, I've studied civil wars. I've studied the kind of dehumanizing rhetoric that militaries and, military authoritarian governments use to justify the extermination of their own people and, committing genocide against their own people. And obviously, I'm not saying we're there to that point in our country, but, it is truly a day that I never thought I would see when, in our country, a democracy, we would have somebody in the White House calling people animals and then actually putting out press releases defending the use of the term. The same person who's used racist insults while in the White House. Again, this is something that I never thought we would see. And I really think it's not an exaggeration to say that our basic rights are under assault right now. And we have to stand up and take a stand against that. I really think that this is a pivotal moment, and we all have an obligation to do something. So that is actually a big part of why I'm running. I think that equal rights are a big part of social justice. Of course, there's an economic justice component to that as well. So that's why I've been emphasizing so much with you all. Investing in people, making sure that people have the opportunities that they want to be healthy and well enough to work hard, to get ahead in life. And when we've got a society that's becoming more and more unequal, more and more people feel that the deck is stacked against them. And in a lot of cases, they're right. If you look at some of the more rural parts of our district, we have places in our district where the median household income is a fourth or a fifth of what it is in our wealthiest suburbs. And that's just within our district. You have this wild inequality. And it's those same communities where people tend to be earning less money, where they're facing some of the biggest challenges if they want to try to get ahead. They're the farthest away from community colleges. Those are places where you can't get high-speed internet. You can't be taking online classes if you wanted to. It's going to be much more difficult for you to actually start that small business. And I think that's wrong. I think that giving people a level playing field isn't about giving people handouts. We know Tom McClintock is going to start screaming socialism in the fall election. He's going to be saying, don't vote for her, she's a socialist, she's a socialist. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that if we actually value hard work, then we have to be a country where, people have the opportunity to work hard and get ahead, and to do so on a level playing field. And that's not the situation we have right now. I think it's wrong.
Are you familiar with the Great Central Valley watershed and the water storage systems in the Sierras?
I would say yes. Yes, this is one of the most important things about our district, that our district does provide a great deal of the water to the rest of the state. So I really support, investing in our infrastructure. I think we have to start by making sure that we're maintaining our existing levees and dams appropriately. We don't want to see another situation like the catastrophe at the Oroville Dam. And we know that we're far behind in the maintenance of a lot of that infrastructure. So I think that absolutely has to be a top priority. We also need to make sure that we're defending the ability of our agricultural producers here in our district to access the water that they need. That we're not simply giving it all away and allowing it all to be taken from us. And people sometimes wonder why Tom McClintock so strongly favors both the Central Valley and Southern California when it comes to water policy. And you have to remember that that's where a lot of his campaign contributions are coming from, is from big agribusiness. And again, I don't have a single contribution from big agribusiness in the Central Valley or Southern California, but I do really care about the needs, of our agricultural producers here, many of whom are smaller and don't necessarily have the clout that a big giant farm or grower is going to have. But I think that their views need to be protected, their rights need to be protected.
Worried about state teachers' retirement come 2020, do you support retired teachers?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it's very important that as a country we keep our promises to our teachers and to other folks who've worked hard and have structured their whole lives around the expectation that the benefits they've earned over the course of their life are going to be there when they need them when they retire. So yes, absolutely. I also think that I'm just really horrified to see the way some teachers who agreed to teach in particular schools now, and I'm talking about folks who are a little bit younger, who are still in their career, there are teachers out there right now who have agreed to teach in particular schools because they thought they were going to get their loans forgiven. And because of glitches in paperwork, and my understanding is mistakes or sort of deceptive practices by the private company administering this program, there are teachers right now who are having their loan forgiveness programs converted into just debt. And so I think that we need to be doing more to protect our teachers and to fight for them at every level, not just when they're retirees, but also when they're starting out in their careers. Because we want to have highly trained, really well qualified, bright, energetic, enthusiastic people out there as teachers in our classrooms. And if we as a country are in the business of breaking promises to our teachers, whether they're new teachers or retirees at the end of their career, that's just going to turn people away from the profession, right? It's going to turn them off from the profession, and our kids aren't going to have the teachers that they need. So I would say I support teachers at every age.
And if you do have questions, just hold them up and someone will come around and pick up your card. Okay. How would you support or promote health access in our district?
All right, I think there are several things that we could do. I mean, first we need to be ensuring that people, are able to either get or keep their health insurance, right? So, don't want to sound like a broken record, but right now there are a lot of threats coming out of Washington that could either take care away from people or make care so expensive in our district that people won't be able to afford the health insurance they once had. So the estimate is that McClintock's vote in favor of the tax bill in December will actually result ultimately in 30,000 people in our district not having health insurance anymore. And once that happens, because they've gotten rid of the individual mandate, and that's going to change people's behavior, but also it's going to change pricing. So prices are going to go up and up and up for insurance, and people won't be able to afford it in the same way. So, when we have a situation where people are losing their insurance, that's putting up a lot of barriers to access for them. But even once someone has insurance, if you have your Medicare, what good is that if there aren't primary care providers in your community? What good is that if you literally can't access the care you need? So I'm a strong supporter of programs to incentivize primary care doctors and nurse practitioners to come practice in rural communities. That can be very effective at getting them out into our communities. Often once they come, they like it, they stay. I've met some really fantastic doctors who ended up in our district through exactly those programs. We also, I think, need to be making sure that we are supporting our rural hospitals so they can be hit very hard by losses in coverage in the community because they tend to depend, if they're smaller, they're really depending on actually getting reimbursed for the care they're providing. And so when, if people continue to lose their health insurance, they're going to get reimbursed for less of the care they're providing, and it really puts them in financial jeopardy. The hospital in Mariposa, for example, was so concerned about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, that Congress tried to push through last year, that the whole hospital board actually wrote a letter to Tom McClintock saying, you right now are casting a vote that could cause our hospital to close. That's a hospital that's really got some financial challenges, and it could have just pushed them over the edge into closing. And for a lot of folks, that's their only 24-hour emergency facility within an hour of their house, perhaps. So it might see, or I think I saw someone say, or more. Yeah, or more. It's a really important staging point for people to get treatment that can be life-saving before they get flown out of there in some cases. It's pretty critical, I think. So sometimes people feel, again, like, oh, if you have Medicare or something, the Affordable Care Act doesn't affect you. Actually, if the Affordable Care Act had been repealed, your emergency room that you rely on might be gone. This is really complicated, but I would say the two main things we need to do are incentivize primary care providers to come out to rural areas, and make sure that we're supporting rural hospitals and not passing legislation that could harm their financial situation.
How will you bring broadband access to rural areas in our district?
Yeah, this is a great question. And there is really a role, I think, for the federal government in pushing to get broadband out into rural communities. And, again, some people, maybe who are more kind of Republican-leaning, will say, well, but let's just let the free market tackle this. I'm sure that private companies will come along and do this one of these days. People have been waiting, for 10 to 15 years at this point, and are just getting left farther and farther behind. And so I think it is time that the government needs to take a stronger role in incentivizing and pushing telecom companies to come out into our rural areas. So I think that needs to be a priority. There are some changes that have been made lately that actually are going to reduce this, or sort of slow or reduce the spread of broadband into rural areas. In particular, there was a rule in place until recently that, so basically there is a rule that says for every mile of line you lay in an urban area, you have to lay the same amount of line into a rural area. Okay. What the Trump administration has gone and done is clarified for telecom companies that to meet the requirement, they don't actually have to be laying line out into rural areas that are unserved right now. They can just double or triple or quadruple up in the closest rural areas, if that makes sense. So if you're in a rural area and you're really lucky and you're close to an urban area, all of a sudden you might find yourself with 2 or 3 or 4 high-speed internet providers that you can choose from. But that person who's just a little bit farther is going to end up with nothing. And if we care about, the outcomes, if we care about more students having access to online classes, if we care about, more people being able to start small businesses, people being able to use telemedicine, we need to be pushing farther and farther, not just sort of doubling and tripling up. So I think that would be one thing to change immediately, that we should, legislate and clarify that they actually need to build out into new terrain rather than being allowed to double and triple up. And more broadly, there are some existing incentive programs, but I think they're not strong enough. They're clearly not doing enough. So I think we need to expand those. And Tom McClintock has actually voted against federal support for rural broadband at least twice. And I think that's just wrong. I think he doesn't realize that we need smart investments here in our region.
Can you share your thoughts on marijuana, especially as it relates to Calaveras County?
Yeah, so I do support at the federal level reducing the classification of marijuana by 1 level. I think that we need to accept that this is the direction the majority of the states have gone in. I think it's absolutely critical that people who are involved in the industry be able to use our banking system and our insurance system. That said, this is where the county level question comes in. I absolutely think that cultivation and sales of marijuana should continue to be controlled by local governments. And this really is a local decision that every county can make for itself. Or sometimes in the case of Calaveras County, places like Calaveras County fight over repeatedly for years. But I do think that, that's a decision that every community should be making. And not one that should be imposed upon them by the federal government. But where we do need changes at the federal level is just to make sure that when cultivation is happening, which we know is happening, to the tune of especially with changes in California. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry at this point. Those folks need to be in our banking system and need to be part of our insurance system, and that can do a lot to reduce some of the instability and crime and insecurity that can accompany the industry right now. So, but I want to be very clear that I think that it's very important for local communities, counties, cities, and towns to be able to decide whether and where it's cultivated. And that's not going to solve any battles happening in Calaveras County, but it does mean that I think those are battles that need to be fought and argued at the local level.
Can you name 2 specific things you'll do to promote economic equity in our district?
Yeah, so I think one specific thing would be to make sure that people who are running small businesses across the district have more equal access to small business development centers, to SBDCs, which are supported by the Small Business Administration. Right now they're mainly available in the area either in Sacramento or closest to Sacramento. I think that we need to do more to be reaching out and making it clear that even folks who are in sort of Mariposa, or Oakhurst or Sonora should have access to those same services. Because someone who's starting a business can actually have a free consultation, essentially with a management consultant for an hour, who will look at your business plan. They'll give really concrete advice. I've actually been out to one of the SBDCs there and have seen some other presentations about this that, they'll go through. And there was one example they gave of someone who wanted to start a yoga studio. And they actually said, hey, I think it's a little risky for you to go rent a space when you don't have your base of clients built up yet. You don't have any, cash and reserves or anything. Why don't you instead alter your plan a bit, start offering your classes at a community center first or at a church or someplace, and then once you feel like you've got a good clientele and a good base going, then go find that space and actually rent it and move in there. A lot of small businesses fail when they first try to get started. So this is something that, it's just one example, right? But it's something that's free, that's a service that the government is providing, you all are paying your taxes for it. And I think just because of the geography of our district and because of the lack of initiative by our representative currently and the lack of communication and cooperation with our chambers of between our representative and our chambers of commerce and other local governments, those services just aren't, people aren't as widely aware of those services as they should be, and not enough is being done to push those folks to actually travel around our district, for example, actually come set up their office hours, in Sonora, in Mariposa, in San Andreas, rather than, again, making people travel so far themselves to get those appointments. So that would be one example. More generally, I think supporting small business is really important. I think another example would be really supporting our community colleges. They're absolutely critical for job training, for folks who might want to go back to school, and I think that we need to be doing everything possible to support them. I also think it's very important that we keep in place the tax incentives right now for people who are going back to school. I was really concerned during the debate over the tax bill last year that at one point they actually proposed eliminating the lifetime learning credit. That didn't actually come to pass. It wasn't actually included in the final bill, but I think that it's really important to be attentive that going to school and getting training is not just for people who are straight out of high school. What the Republicans in the House were proposing replacing it with would have been a much more limited credit that only would have applied to people who were within their first 5 years of graduating from high school. So you wouldn't have had access to those tax incentives if someone went back to school later to change careers or to get some sort of new training. Again, I think that's wrong, and I think we need to be providing as much support as possible to folks in our district who maybe want to get additional training and move into a higher paying job.
You have talked about dozens of things you would like to see. What 3 or 4 things are you committed to getting done?
All right. That's a good question, because I think it's, there's a lot out there, right? And people sometimes say that sort of all Democrats kind of seem the same in this election. I think that when it comes to our priorities, though, we are a bit different. You know, like I said, especially because it's kind of low-hanging fruit and it's really important for our district. You know, by low-hanging fruit, I just mean it's something where we know the votes are there, we know we can take action on it pretty fast. I do think that a Clean Dream Act is going to go on my list of 4. I'm going to go for 4 because it lets me have more priorities. All right, but you guys have to hold me to it because there's a lot of important things there. We're going to do Clean Dream Act. Probably getting Medicare negotiating for prescription drugs. Because again, I think that's doable in the short term. There's a good amount of Republican interest in that. And it would give us a lot more money than that we're saving to work with to have other fixes in the healthcare system. I mean, I would say restoring the cost-sharing reduction payments to insurance companies. Those were the payments that Trump cut off all of a sudden last year that threw our insurance system into total disarray. And we're actually responsible for driving up health insurance premiums for everyone. I mean, some of the estimates are that it may have driven prices up by as much as 18%. So I think that restoring those payments and, you know, again, acting to stabilize the individual insurance market has to be a really high priority. So see, we've got 2 about healthcare at this point, and I think that is actually really important for our district. You know, and then for a 4th, I think I would say, you know, much better legislation on wildfire prevention. You know, again, this is an area where right now we have policies that are not in line with the science. And this is putting people in active danger in our district. You know, there is a bill out there right now by Maria Cantwell is one of the co-sponsors of it, for example. I think it starts to move us in the right direction. You know, her bill actually starts to invest more money in communities, you know, rather than spending so much money in the backcountry. That's really the approach that I take to fire prevention. I mean, I think we need to be giving homeowners incentives to replace their roofs with fire-resistant materials, to put guards on the vents, you know, in their roofs so embers don't fly in during a fire. There's a few other things you can do to a home to actually make it pretty fire-resistant. The trouble is, who has the money for that? You know, so to the extent that someone is replacing their roof anyhow, or needs to make some other repairs to their home, you know, I think we need to be giving them tax incentives to get them doing that in the most fire-safe way possible. I think we need to provide more support so that people can actually you know, maintain their defensible space around their home. You know, and we really need to start investing. I think we need to think about fire prevention starting in the communities and starting where the people are, and then working our way back out. Because the fact of the matter is, even if you have a giant fire that's coming through your area, you know, if as a community, if everyone has done a great job with their defensible space, and ideally, if we have as many fire-resistant structures as possible that are in place there, you know, most communities, most of their structures will survive even a large fire. And so, you know, I think that the way we're spending our money right now, the priorities are wrong there. And we need both more money and a smarter allocation of how we're spending that fire prevention money.
Your experience is mostly academic and theoretical. What is your practical experience? What practical accomplishments have you achieved?
Okay. So that's a really funny question for me to get, because I will tell you that when I was studying for my PhD, I would often get summoned into my advisor's office. And he would sit me down in a chair, and he would say, "You just wrote me this amazing chapter, and there's no theory in here." And I mean, this is kind of, I guess, sort of a little bit of an esoteric question, but you know, the thing that my advisors were constantly telling me was, "You're too practical of a person. You need to be more theoretical." You know, that getting a PhD is supposed to be all about developing new theories. And you know, and honestly, my orientation toward the world has always been very pragmatic. You know, the thing I want to find out isn't really which theory is the best theory or which theory is the most perfect. The thing I want to find out is what works, and also why. You know, I think if you don't understand the mechanisms, if you don't understand the process by which you're getting outcomes, then you know, you have to understand the why and the how. So that was always my orientation in my research, was trying to look at literal effectiveness. But then as a researcher, I've always been very curious about the process, the hows and the whys, that you get the outcomes that you get. And so that means that most of the research that I've done is actually very practical and tangible and hands-on. So for my dissertation, for example, I went back to Guatemala, where I had been in the Foreign Service before, and actually spent a total of about a year in post-conflict communities. So I was interviewing former combatants, former militia members. I was interviewing people who had been victims of very serious human rights violations during the Civil War there, as well as people still involved in illicit security groups and security patrols today, and members of the military, in some cases, police. There were a really wide range of people I ended up interviewing for that project. But it was really a very field-based project. I guess similar to the grassroots structure of our campaign, I've always really, in my own work, my research, really sought to understand and give a voice to the experiences of ordinary people. I don't know if I really encourage you to do this because it's really long, but if anyone wants to go download my dissertation and go read it, those are the voices that you're going to find in there the most. I did hundreds of interviews with, very normal people, but who had lived through an extraordinary set of experiences during the Guatemalan Civil War and the total crisis of insecurity that has enveloped the country since. People sometimes don't realize this, but unfortunately, post-war Guatemala has been one of the more dangerous places in the world for years, unfortunately. At the time I was starting my project, my dissertation project, it seemed entirely possible that more people could be killed in the first 36 years of peace in Guatemala that were killed during the 36-year Civil War, because there was such an explosion of violent crime there. And, so in my project I was looking at how local communities' experiences during the Civil War were affecting their approaches towards security today, and looking particularly at how military organized and sponsored militias during the Civil War have persisted into sort of vigilante groups that operate there today. So I don't usually talk about this a lot with people because it's both kind of a depressing topic. I sometimes joke with my husband that this is literally true. If you look at our Amazon account, I like books, I like to read a lot. A lot of the books that I buy are about genocide, wars, human rights violations, and then we buy a lot of books about parenting. So the other half of our account is, how to put your baby to sleep, 10 lullabies for your toddler, kind of stuff like that. So that's the nature of the work that I've done. And, you might think, academic research, that's someone just sort of sitting off, typing on a computer somewhere. For me, it's been quite the opposite. And, that's actually what my work is known for in kind of my profession, is that really close connection to people on the ground. And, frankly, being a really good interviewer. That's one of the things that I ended up teaching at the university level, is how to do this kind of qualitative field research. So I actually ended up developing a very well-regarded course to teach students, in particular, how to go do this kind of research, how to do it respectfully, and one of my areas of expertise is how to do this in high-risk settings. In settings where there's either ongoing conflict or a lot of violence happening for some other reason. So that's something that I've lectured on internationally as well, and I'm really well regarded in that field. But my whole orientation is really working with people and doing research that's grounded with people, very practical. I think there were some other questions in there about, I guess, just getting practical results.
What practical accomplishments have you achieved?
Oh, great, okay. So I told you a lot about my academic work there and kind of what it really entails. I've done a wide variety of other things in my life. So back in the day, if you wanted me to list off, someone recently said to me in writing that I haven't ever done anything outside academia. That was their impression, that I'm just sort of some academic person who's never had a normal job outside of that, besides this little stint in the State Department. Let's do a game here. Let's list off all my jobs. It's hard for me to remember them all because I'm a person who's had a lot of jobs and a lot of very varied experiences in my life. All right, I had a babysitting empire. We're going to start at the very beginning. I babysat my way into being able to do some very interesting things as a teenager, including being an exchange student. I really wanted to be an exchange student. And I was able to do that in high school. All right, so babysitting, softball umpiring, sandwich making and bagel toasting, ice cream scooping. I sold clothes at the Gap, I was a research assistant at the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. So going back to some social justice there. When I was in college at Stanford, that was part-time. I was a research assistant for a professor who was working with an NGO in San Francisco on some human rights trials. So that was another job. I was kind of a field researcher for the Chilean Ministry of Agriculture for 3 months in the summer when I was in college. So I was actually getting sent out to rural communities, doing interviews with people. I ended up doing about 90 interviews in Spanish with people who were trying to start small businesses actually out in this rural community and trying to understand, you know, why their businesses were succeeding and failing, and then wrote up a big report about that in Spanish. I should say that I have a very high level of Spanish, which is very useful. So I did that for a summer. Then I was a public interest law fellow for a few months before I joined the Foreign Service, when I was just getting my security clearance, and then had been assigned a position in the Foreign Service, but I had a few months to kill. And I'm not a person who likes downtime. I mean, I never have a few months to kill. If I have a few months in my hands, I'm going to go do something meaningful with it. So I did that for a few months, and then actually worked on this human rights trial that ended up happening in Fresno. It's kind of a long story, but this was related to the assassination of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, who some of you might be familiar with. And I mean, I'm sorry, we have a lot of questions. Okay, but this is, I've been getting a lot of questions on my background, so I just want to take a minute and actually tell you about this. You know, so one of the members of the Salvadoran military, who was among the top people who plotted Romero's assassination, actually ended up living in the United States and selling used cars in Modesto. Can't make this stuff up. And this human rights organization, the Center for Justice and Accountability, based in San Francisco, became aware of this. Members of the Romero family became aware of this also. So they decided to use the federal court system in the US to bring a civil suit against him. You can't have a criminal trial here about, you know, a murder that occurred in another country, but you can actually, when it meets certain requirements, use the federal courts to have a civil case and to try to find someone responsible. And you know, it was, the people involved felt that it was very important because it was also the first attempt at any kind of accountability for that assassination, which was one of the things that plunged El Salvador into its civil war. And you know, it was going to establish a historical record, really, for the first time of what had happened. And so that was where I had been working with a professor at Stanford for about a year, you know, helping to get ready for that trial. And then over the summer before the trial, I was able to be a full-time public interest law fellow through a fellowship that I'd gotten. And actually, so just work full-time, by which I mean 19 hours a day. You know, it was very intense to be working on a trial like this. And you know, I was at the bottom of this hierarchy of people, but I feel like my contributions were important. You know, I was the person digging through old newspapers and trying to find the news clippings to show who knew whom within the Salvadoran military, who was likely talking to whom, because that was part of the case. You know, if two people appear at a wedding together in the newspaper, they can't plausibly claim that they don't know what the other one is ordering troops to do. So this is really minute kind of gathering of evidence. But again, I'm a practical, tangible, you know, results-oriented person, and so I think I did make, you know, a significant contribution to the trial itself, where, you know, in absentia, Sarabia, this person, was found responsible. It was very important. I mean, it was a sort of a hallmark in moving forward toward accountability in that case. You can go back and look up some of the news coverage. It was in the New York Times at the time. It was, you know, it was a big deal, and I was proud to be part of it. So then I went and joined the State Department. I did a variety of things there, but if we're looking for practical experience, you know, I would mention managing the visa fraud prevention unit at the embassy. You know, I got additional training in visa fraud and actually had to be leading visa fraud investigations and seeing them to their conclusion. And even while I've been in doing my PhD and in academia, I mean, I've still done things that relate to government, providing advice. At one point I was an election observer for the Organization of American States. And so I actually ended up, you know, going back to Guatemala and was responsible for going around a department there, sort of an area of the country, you know, talking to the police, talking to some of the stakeholders before the election, actually observing at the polling places, and then, you know, writing up the reports for the Organization of American States. So I've done a pretty wide range of things, actually, over my career. All right, we'll go really fast.
Yeah, that's more.
All right.
Okay, so these are two of basically the same question. What's been your role as a military analyst, and can you explain what you did as a military security analyst?
us?
Absolutely. So this is referring to my ballot designation, which is Military Security Analyst. The reason that I ended up putting that on the ballot is because it refers to my research, some of which I've been describing for you all. So in addition to having gotten my PhD from a part of the political science department at Yale, it's called the Program on Order, Conflict, and Violence, which is specialized in civil wars, basically. I've taught, back when I was still at Yale, I taught post-conflict, it's called post-conflict politics or post-conflict reconstruction. I mean, I literally taught as a teaching assistant part of international security there. The class called International Security. So this is definitely the field that I've worked in throughout my career. And, we ended up putting that particular description because the most recent research that I've been doing and publishing is about how militaries train civilians and militia members and use them during civil wars. And it ties in with my dissertation research. You guys might see some connections there because I was talking about having spent time in Guatemala, having interviewed ex-combatants, former militia members. What I ended up doing then most recently is preparing a different sort of separate article that was part of a special project on socialization in armed groups and militaries. So looking at sort of how militaries and armed groups socialize people and train their people and why. And I participated in that research project for about, probably about a year and a half or so. We had multiple meetings, had some conferences, each wrote up different papers, with people who are specialized in different, generally militaries and armed groups around the world, and then put that together and got our papers accepted, through the peer review process to do a special journal issue on socialization in armed groups. And so that was the last published work that I was doing in my career back into 2017, and giving talks primarily about that work and other military and security issues at universities around the country and actually around the world. I didn't give any international talks in 2017, but I did in 2016. So that's my work, and when you go on the ballot, if you have a profession, you can choose how you describe that profession, right? So like my mom teaches nursing at Sierra College, which is our community college over there closer to Roseville and Rockland. And so she's a registered nurse, she works at the hospital, and she teaches at the community college. So the range of things that she might reasonably end up listing, if she was to run for Congress, could be registered nurse, could be healthcare provider, could be college instructor, could be nursing instructor. There's a whole range of things that you might end up putting. So, I chose to focus on the research side of my job as a tenure track professor, which, in my case, especially because I was teaching at MIT, where frankly there aren't many undergrads who are interested in social sciences, research was actually a very large percentage of my job and of my responsibilities. I would say it was taking up about 80% of my time, and the teaching part would take up about 20%. I do get questions from people sometimes who say, well, why didn't you also put professor? And I gave 3 choices when I filled out this form for the Secretary of State. I thought they might feel it important to include the education part of what I was doing also. So my second choice, which I would have been totally happy with if they'd said, oh, you need to go to your second choice, would have been security analyst / educator, or educator / security analyst. But they were fine with just focusing on the research, so that was the direction I chose to go in when it comes to appearing on the ballot.
Okay, why did you back out of your promise to drop out of the race after the Democratic Party endorsement?
Absolutely. So I get this question frequently, and at some point we can make a compilation of all the town halls and have me go through, I've answered this at every town hall. I'm happy to do it again. All right, I'm curious, how many of you are members of a Democratic Party club who are here? Okay, so a few people, maybe, I don't know, eyeballing half, more than a few. But there's a lot of people who are not part of a Democratic Party club. So it's important to, I think, back up and explain what this question is even about. So over the course of the last year, there are a lot of Democrats running for Congress here, and all the candidates were frequently asked, if someone else gets endorsed by the California Democratic Party, would you drop out of the race? For months, all the candidates said yes. And then all the candidates changed their minds. And for me, I changed my mind last. That's absolutely true. I had, I think, more faith in the process than perhaps the other candidates did. I, have volunteered for a lot of campaigns before. I'm a pretty idealistic person. I really thought that and hoped that the process was going to be a little bit more sound that was used than what ultimately happened. I had two main concerns about the endorsement process as it actually unfolded. The first was a real lack of vetting of the candidates. I really thought that at some point the Democratic Party was going to pick up the telephone, call our former employers, try to verify a little bit of the information that we were providing as candidates. Strangely, that never happened. I think this is certainly I think the most serious and highest profile job I've ever applied for. And weirdly, I think I have faced the least scrutiny as a candidate in this process so far as compared to anything else I've ever applied for. Back when I was 20 and, taking and passing the Foreign Service exams and trying to get into the Foreign Service, the process I went through then was much more rigorous than the process that our Democratic Party has tried to use in this race, to ascertain who would be a good and qualified candidate. And that is deeply disturbing to me. Because I think it's important that we have people in Congress, who are able and willing to stand up for truth and accountability. But I also think it's very important for our chances of beating Tom McClintock in the fall, that we have a strong, credible, qualified candidate. And at the end of the day, I was not confident in the vetting process or lack thereof that was used by the Democratic Party in our race, which had been explicitly promised to us at the time we were making these commitments to get out of the race. That's one reason. The bigger reason, though, that I decided to stay in the race is because there was a weird disconnect in our district between a lot of grassroots support and the decisions that the delegates from this district made when they went to the convention in San Diego. And it typically happens, and what I expected would happen is that, usually if your Democratic clubs in a district, by and large, are voting to support a candidate, you would think that the delegates who go to the state convention would vote the same way. Or you would think that if there was an even split in grassroots support in a district, that the delegates would just say, okay, we're not going to intervene in this. We're not going to choose to endorse one candidate or the other. In our district, even though by most measures, I really had the most grassroots support among folks in the district, our activists, our club members, our delegates voted to endorse someone else. And so that left me with some choices, none of which were good, right? Not a lot of great options on the table at that point. One option would have been to say to the activists and the volunteers who had gotten involved in our campaign and who would come out to all these candidates fora, who would come out to their clubs, and in some cases join Democratic clubs for the first time, to say to them all, you tried to make your voices heard, you tried to make a difference, and you have been crushed by a party machine. This is just the system making its decisions, and we just have to honor it. I think that would be really bad for grassroots organizing here in our district in the long run. I think it would be really disillusioning to people here. So another option was to say, yes, I'm going to change my mind, and I'm actually going to continue as a candidate, and I'm going to continue, honoring the preferences of the people here who have been very involved in the campaign. And that was the choice that I made. And I understand that, people may not agree with that. That's fine. In that case, that's why we're having an election, and you're perfectly free to vote for another candidate if you would like to. But I felt that it was important to continue my campaign. And again, some interesting things have happened since I made that decision. So, just recently, as Robert mentioned in the beginning, the Sacramento Bee, the Modesto Bee, and a few other papers as well, but particularly the Sacramento Bee, came out with a strongly worded endorsement in favor of me. Really saying clearly that I'm the candidate who would be best qualified and best positioned to take on Tom McClintock in the fall. And I think their phrase was that I would give him the toughest battle. And that's what we all want, is we all want to go beat Tom McClintock. So I think that, there are a number of different twists and turns that the story has taken. There's a lot of different information for you to consider. And I guess I would encourage you to consider the Democratic Party, the California Democratic Party's endorsement as just one piece of information. Nationally, for example, the Democratic Party is neutral in our race here.
This is kind of a follow-up question to that. How will you feel if two Republicans win the primary because you split the vote and dishonored your campaign promise?
All right, so this is a concern about the idea that 2 Republicans could advance into the November into the November general election. This is a concern in some districts in California. It is not a concern in our district. The way I feel about that question is that it is a question meant to engage in fear-mongering. That is when you're made to feel fearful and people are trying to coerce you into making a decision that's not based on facts or evidence. So let me tell you the facts, right? I'm actually curious, besides the person who wrote the question, does anybody here really know who the other Republican is who's running here or know much about him? Okay, so few people. Can you tell us something about him?
Hasn't raised much money, doesn't seem to have a high profile.
Okay, so that's accurate. That was hasn't raised much money, doesn't seem to have a high profile. What can you guys tell us about him?
He dislikes Tom McClintock's Medicare or health care.
Yeah, he thinks
He's
Tom
even to the
McClintock.
right of Tom McClintock. Speaking as a Jessica Moore supporter, I don't feel that Mitchell White is going to draw votes away. And so I am willing to stand up and say, I don't believe that that is as big of an issue as some people are making it. That being said, as a Jessica Moore supporter, if anybody has questions afterwards in the parking lot, I'm more than happy to chat with you. But I don't feel, I will give this one to Regina, I don't feel that it's if Mitchell White were a stronger Republican, or should the Koch brothers decide June 6th or June 1st, hey, we could win this sucker, we need to pump tons and tons of money in, I don't think it's a realistic assumption.
Okay, thank you for that intervention, Elaine. I really appreciate that. So this other person, right, for 2 Republicans to make it onto the ballot in November, you have to have 2 Republicans who are viable candidates in the first place. On the ballot, we have Tom McClintock. That man is going to November. I mean, we've all just got to accept that, right? This mythical other Republican is a guy named Mitchell White. He actually went to my high school, but I didn't know him because he went there 10 years later. So he's approximately 26-ish. He's also from Roseville. You were right to say he hasn't raised money. As far as we know, we believe he's raised less than $10,000. He wasn't even able to put a statement, a candidate statement, in the voter information guide, in all the counties in the district, as far as I understand. He has no political experience. He has no endorsements. By all measures, he is not a serious candidate. You'll notice if you go take a look at the Sacramento Bee's endorsement column, they didn't even interview him, right? They didn't interview Robert Lawton either, who's kind of a similar candidate but on the Democratic side in the sense of somebody who's put their name on the ballot but isn't actually running a campaign. Again, my feeling is that this is just, sometimes there's confusion. There's confusion about how the system works. It's easy to be reading national news and see headlines like, Democrats fear disaster in California. And that's right, Democrats do fear disaster in California in some districts. Our district is not one of them. So this is not a realistic concern. The real question that we are deciding in this election is which Democrat is going to advance onto November with Tom McClintock. That's really what we're asking you to decide.
Can I interrupt for a second? Stacey Abrams just won the Georgia primary.
Okay, so that was another example of a contested primary where actually the 2 principal candidates, as far as I'm aware, were both women and were actually both named Stacey. So your choices could be even more confusing than they are here. All right, I'll try to go quickly.
All right.
All right, so we're going to do rapid fire answers here because we have a lot of questions.
All right, so you're doing great. Will you commit to attending/participating in a unity event for soon after June 5th, regardless of who wins?
Yes.
All right. All right. That was
We're going fast.
All right. I'm a former teacher, grades 7 to 12, and appreciate honesty and find your honesty refreshing. I do understand compromise, but not where principles are concerned.
Okay, thank you for the comment. We're going to go to the next person here.
I've seen multiple campaigns sling mud and play politics to cause candidates grief. Your campaign has done this as well. Why is that?
Well, I have a little longer answer here. I would disagree with the premise of the question. I think that ad hominem attacks on someone, Trump, making up pejorative little names for other people in his own party and things like that, I think that's really unacceptable. I think that being impolite to other people is unacceptable. I disagree with the premise that asking hard questions of other candidates is mudslinging, or that raising concerns about facts about other candidates, their positions, or their qualifications is mudslinging. I just don't agree with that. And, I think that, again, this is a very serious matter. And this is an election where our candidates in this district have not been appropriately vetted, and where there has not been serious media attention directed at this race at any point up to the present. Tomorrow is an extraordinary day because it looks like I might talk to 2 journalists in the same day. That's very rare. There has been really no normal level of media coverage directed toward our race, I think because of our geography, and because for a long time people thought this district wasn't as competitive as other districts. It's not as high profile as, let's put it this way, I think on the night of our primary, I don't think people are going to be checking their cell phones in Georgia and saying, this person won, that person won in this primary. This is not a race where we've really had, the kind of independent scrutiny from the media that you might expect that your candidates have gone through. And so I wish that, frankly, we had a stronger party structure here that had done a more aggressive vetting of the candidates. I wish that we had stronger media in our region that could be out asking hard questions so I didn't have to. But this is the point that we've come to, and I do think that the reason we have a democracy and, multiple different options in an election is to force candidates, to do exactly what we're doing here right now, which is to come out and answer questions and be able to explain themselves, or not. And, if there is a problem with a candidate in this race, it is better to know that now than to find that out in October and lose the general election because of it.
So this question is pretty much the same. I'm not sure if you have more to add to it,
All right,
but
let's hear it.
Okay. The flyer we received in the mail was aggressive and very negative, and I thought was disappointing. In fact, it appeared to be a desperate move. Why go this route?
All right, so the flyer that you're referring to there is a flyer summarizing both the Sacramento Bee's endorsement of me and concerns that the media have raised about another Democrat in this race, Jessica Morse. Why go there? I think it is important for voters to be educated about their choices. And if you are fully aware of all the facts and information and you prefer another candidate, that's fine with me. What's not fine with me is people making choices without the full set of information, because we need to be smart and we need to think about how this is going to play out as we go into a general election. When John Ossoff ran for Congress in Georgia, he raised $30 million for this special election for this one House seat in Georgia. Some of you might remember that was last year. It was the first sort of election after Trump had been elected president. There was a lot of national attention. And, it's hard to say why he lost the election exactly. But one thing that became a major issue was his exaggeration of his resume. And he was just hammered mercilessly. I mean, if you go to Google, you have to have kind of a strong stomach to do this, but go to Google, John Ossoff attack ads or something, and, you will see that all he did was say that he had 5 years of experience as a national security staffer in Congress. That's what he was going around saying. Turns out a couple of those years were part-time while he was a college student, and so this was just an issue with numbers of years, right? And this spiraled into this whole narrative and really, really, really aggressive hammering away at his credibility. And, that raises some real concerns for me in this race. I had someone say to me the other day, this was when we were door knocking, someone said, well, what if one Democrat wins the election in June, in the sense of advancing in one of the top 2 positions, and then once the scrutiny starts up from the Republican Party, maybe in August, September, October, there are really serious problems like this, or problems that are made to seem serious. Can we just swap you 2 out then? Can we just say, hey, we're going to go back to the person who finished in the next position in June and just swap you in? I said, no, you can't do that. This gets completely decided in June. You know, we have to make a smart decision now and think about who's really going to be the strongest candidate to go up against McClintock in the fall. And so to do that, I think it is really important that you have the full set of information about our recent employment history and, you know, about concerns that journalists have raised about one of the other candidates' records in this race.
This is not a question. I support you because I have seen how consistent your answers have been from the very beginning. I like how down to earth you seem to be. I would be satisfied if you represent me, our district, in the Congress.
Hey, thank you.
What do you think of the tactics used by the Democratic Party in the 2016 election?
I don't have a strong opinion about this. I mean, I think this might be referring to sort of intra-Democratic Party fighting during the primary. I mean, the thing I actually really encourage people to do is to not get mired in the conflicts of the past. I mean, what's now coming up on 2 years ago. We have a real challenge on our hands here. I mean, we have things we need to be doing right now for this election. This year presents us with a tremendous opportunity to go beat Tom McClintock. And we shouldn't waste it. We shouldn't be distracted. We shouldn't be thinking about the past. You know, McClintock is so vulnerable right now because he's asleep at the wheel. He's essentially not running a campaign. And I'm not convinced that he's really going to be able to get one off the ground or do much in the next few months. And so we've got a great opportunity to come in with a strong qualified candidate and go get his seat from him and actually win here and do this right. So I would really encourage, you know, anybody who's got sort of lingering concerns or suspicions or this or that from 2016, you know, I would just say put it on hold. You can think about that after November 2018, after we've gone and beaten Tom McClintock, and then you can think about it to your heart's content. But for now, let's focus on the task at hand.
What separates you from Jessica Morse?
All right, so real quickly, you know, I do think that having the credibility and qualifications to pose a serious challenge to McClintock in the fall is very important. And I do think that I would stand a better chance of surviving the scrutiny of a general election campaign and really doing the strongest possible job of running against him in the fall. But on policy things, you know, our positions on health care, I believe, are different. At least at most points in the past, they've been different. Throughout most of 2017, Jessica Morse supported or appeared to support single-payer health insurance at the federal level and has sort of changed her position to price transparency, universal primary care, a whole range of things. I really wish that we had ever been able to have a debate with some sort of back and forth between candidates to discuss this. I wish she was here right now and we could actually understand what her position is on health care, but she's not. So I would say that, you know, our views have been generally different though on healthcare, and that I've been much more consistent in my positions. You know, and again, we know Tom McClintock is going to go around screaming socialism and Marxism and all these things in the fall, trying to frighten people here. And I think that even if a candidate no longer says that they're for a single payer at the federal level, you can bet that that will be splashed across your television screen day in and day out for most of November. If she's the in October, if she's the candidate running against him. And so I think it's, you know, I've thought carefully about my positions on healthcare and have been consistent about them since day one. When it comes to climate change, you know, I do support a carbon fee and dividend. I think it's quite strange, frankly, that a lot of her, you know, mailers and things that she's sending out are very environmentally oriented, and yet they don't include the words climate change. I mean, go home and look at that thing. Look at it carefully. I actually really make it a point. You know, I'll tell you that if you're making a tiny flyer like this, it's really hard to work with your consultants and your graphic designers and things to do it because they just kept telling me you have to cut words out, you have to cut words out. And I told them, all right, there's a couple words that are non-negotiable, and those words are climate change. You know, I don't understand how you can be a Democrat running against Tom McClintock in this district, you know, and say you're for the environment and not be willing to take a strong stance on climate change and actually communicate that to the voters. Because if you're not emphasizing that in your campaign, you know, if you've got an entire video that's about frankly, the great outdoors, that doesn't mention climate change, then how are you really going to go cast those tough votes in Congress? Because we know that House, members of the House practically start running for re-election their first day on the job. And so that's why, I try to keep my priorities and my policies consistent with the promises that I'm making to you. And I do think that I have a much stronger position on climate change.
I have concern over the loss of our government support for trades programs for particularly young folk who are not destined for academic college. I feel our high schools and community colleges are retreating from these programs that can give purpose and careers to some of our more vulnerable citizens.
Okay, real fast, completely agreed. I think that at the high school level, we need to do more to support our schools in general. In particular, I think the federal government needs to meet its obligations to fund special education. If they did that, it would then free up more money for our schools to keep some of those technical and vocational programs. Or I should say, I've heard of really great agricultural programs also that high schools want to keep, that in some cases they have to cut because they are mandated to provide those special education services. And so they go cut all the other things that seem to be electives in order to do it. So that's starting at the high school level. At the college and community college level, I absolutely agree we need to be investing in this type of training. There's a lot of great skills and careers that folks can learn right here in our community colleges. And then I also wanted to mention, my support for unions and for organized labor. They have great apprenticeship programs and, really can be a very good pathway for folks who come out of high school and want to learn a trade and then want to get themselves into a good paying job.
What are your thoughts on services for the intellectually disabled?
Yeah, we need more of them and they need to be protected. I was just mentioning my support of special education a little bit, but also, when we're talking about both and Social Security program, and it depends on the person's circumstances, of course, and what we mean by that term exactly, but there are a lot of federal programs that do end up being a very important lifeline, for folks who have different disabilities, and I think that protecting that funding is really important. And that should be a core value of our society, that we actually take care of those who are among the most vulnerable in our communities.
In addition to gun control, what do you propose to do to keep our kids safe at school? What can be done to identify students at risk for committing violence? Are there any social programs that you feel need to be implemented or expanded to support teachers and administrators in this area?
Absolutely. So again, we need to do everything possible to support our schools and our school districts so that we can keep counselors in our schools. When you look at the burden of how many students the average counselor has to work with these days, it's astronomical. There's no way that counselors can really have that sort of relationship and knowledge of those students. So, we need to make sure that we're funding those types of programs. And again, we really need to make sure that both students and parents, both younger people and parents have access to the mental health services that they need. We know that it can put a lot of stress on students and can really affect their behavior in school when their family has serious challenges or when a parent has mental health issues that are going unaddressed. So again, I think that some of the changes we've seen in our country are really important. The Affordable Care Act expanding parity to mental health treatment, for example. This is important. This is something that we need to fight to keep and to expand and actually to have more care providers in our communities. This is an area where, again, sometimes people have health insurance for mental health treatment and they can't get an appointment somewhere for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. I think that investing broadly in the health of our community and the health of our young people, could do something to change that. But I do want to emphasize that, I absolutely support universal background checks at the federal level. I also support reviving the federal assault weapons ban. And I think that those really need to be priorities. And McClintock would never support even those kinds of common sense measures. Okay, this is our last one, I guess. These are both kind of the same.
We have a wonderful community college here with a good forestry and fire training program. What we need are tech schools for our area. How would you support this? And this one says green card that says tech schools should have said trade schools. So this one is,
Okay, it's a
okay, so instead
correction.
of tech schools, it's a trade schools. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, looks like there's one more sneaking in. Okay, we'll do one more after this, and then we'll have to, I think, shut this down, because you guys have been an enthusiastic audience full of questions. I'm impressed by the ratio of questions to people. Sometimes you have to sort of pull them out of people, but you guys did a good job. Yeah, I mean, on the question of tech or trade schools, I think I would actually just love to talk to whoever wrote that question after this. You know, there's different models that you can use. I'm most familiar with the idea of housing those programs within our community colleges. If there is some reason why that's not a good fit here, or some issue that's preventing that from happening in the community college here, I would love to know about it. You know, I mean, I'll say I've been out to Columbia College, but I am more familiar with Sierra College just because it's across the street from our office in Rockland. And, you know, we talk to people there a little bit more, I go over there a little bit more. You know, I am aware that they've done some really great things with having advanced machining courses and things like that. I know they struggle to bring in qualified instructors. That's one of the more common difficulties I've heard, that especially, it's one thing to say we want to have all these trade schools. There is such a shortage of, you know, qualified tradespeople right now, and frankly, in some